She stood at the stove stirring warm milk over torn toast, never opening a recipe box. 25 breakfasts your grandmother made without thinking twice, all gone now. Post-war kitchens in the late 1940s and 1950s were caught between two worlds. Refrigerators were finally common, electric ranges were replacing wood stoves, but the habits of the Depression and the war years had not gone anywhere. Families still stretched what they had. Breakfast was not yet the cold cereal bowl we know today. It was cooked, it was frugal, and it used every scrap from the night before. That is the world we are stepping into. Milk toast was the first thing most children in the 1950s ate when they were sick, and most weeks nobody thought twice about it either. Buttered toast, torn or whole, sitting in a bowl of warm milk with a little sugar. It sounds strange now. It was comfort then, the same instinct behind chicken soup, and it used up bread that was going stale and milk that needed using before it turned. The recipe was never written down, but every woman knew it by heart. Milk toast did not come from a cookbook. It came from watching your mother make it for you, and then making it for your own children the exact same way, down to how long the bread sat before it went soft. That kind of knowledge does not survive in a world of printed recipes and searchable websites. It survives in hands, and when the hands stop, the dish goes quiet. Creamed chipped beef on toast came home from the war in a way most breakfast dishes never do. Servicemen ate it in mess halls all through World War II and Korea. Thin, dried beef in a peppery white sauce spooned over toast. And when those men came home, they asked their wives to make it the same way. It became a Saturday morning fixture in houses all over the country by the mid-1950s, a dish with a military memory hiding inside an ordinary skillet. Fried cornmeal mush might be the most completely vanished dish on this list, and almost nobody under 60 has tasted it. You cooked cornmeal into a thick porridge the night before, poured it into a loaf pan, let it set overnight in the icebox, then sliced it cold in the morning and fried it crisp in bacon drippings. Serve it with syrup or apple butter, and you had a breakfast that used nothing but cornmeal, water, and yesterday's bacon fat. This was not a treat dish. It was a stretch dish, the kind of thing farm families made because it turned almost nothing into a full plate. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and fried mush is a perfect example. It traces back to colonial hasty pudding. It fed families through the Depression, and by the 1950s, it was still ordinary breakfast fare in small towns and farm kitchens across the Midwest and Appalachia. In Pennsylvania Dutch country, the local version of that same idea had a name of its own. Scrapple, a loaf of cornmeal, buckwheat flour, and pork scraps simmered down and set firm, then sliced and pan-fried until the outside turned dark and crisp. It came from the same frugal instinct as fried mush, waste nothing, but Scrapple had its own regional identity, and it is one of the only dishes on this list you can still find on a diner menu today. Grits with red-eye gravy is a Southern breakfast that still exists in pockets today, but the full ritual of it has faded almost everywhere else. You fried country ham in a skillet, poured black coffee into the leftover drippings to make a thin reddish gravy, and spooned it straight over a bowl of hot grits. The coffee cut through the salt of the ham, and the whole thing came together in one pan with nothing wasted. Biscuits and Sawmill Gravy fed logging camps and farm families long before it fed a diner customer. The gravy was simple, flour browned in sausage or salt pork drippings, thinned with milk, poured thick and peppery over a split biscuit. It disappeared from store shelves, but it still works. And in the 1950s, it was one of the most common ways to make a small amount of meat feed a whole table of hungry people before a long day of work. Salt pork and milk gravy was the version families made when sausage was not in the budget that week. A few slices of salt pork fried until crisp, the fat used to make a plain milk gravy, poured over biscuits or leftover cornbread. It was blander than Sawmill Gravy, and everybody knew it, but it filled a plate, and in a decade where a single income often fed 5 or 6 people, filling the plate mattered more than impressing anyone. Fried mush was often finished with sorghum or cane syrup instead of maple, especially in the South and lower Midwest, because maple syrup was expensive and sorghum was made close to home. The syrup was thicker, darker, and had a mineral edge maple never had. A family with a sorghum press in the county could trade for a jug that lasted most of the winter, and that jug showed up on the breakfast table morning after morning. Junket was a boxed dessert mix that somehow became a breakfast food, and almost nobody remembers that part of its history. It used rennet, the same enzyme used in cheese-making, to set warm, sweetened milk into a soft custard without any baking at all. It was marketed as easy to digest, gentle on the stomach, perfect for children and for older relatives who could not handle a heavier meal, and it sat in pantries across the country through the decade. It disappeared from store shelves, but it still works, and that is true of Junket in a very literal sense. The brand technically still exists, but the habit of setting it for breakfast is gone. What changed was not the dish. It was the rhythm of the morning. Nobody has 15 quiet minutes to let a custard set before school anymore, and that is as much a story about time as it is about taste. Postum sat at the breakfast table in households that avoided coffee entirely. It was a roasted grain drink, dark and slightly bitter, first sold in 1895 by C.W. Post, and it traced its roots back to the same Battle Creek health movement that gave America Kellogg's cereal in the first place. Many households drank it for religious or health reasons of their own, others simply because it was what their mother had always poured, and by the 1950s, it still had a loyal following. Grapefruit halves sprinkled with sugar sat on more 1950s breakfast tables than almost anything else on this list, because it was marketed as the light, modern, figure-conscious way to start the day. It traced back to grapefruit diet fads from earlier in the century, and it came with its own special utensil, a serrated grapefruit spoon that showed up in nearly every wedding registry of the era. That spoon still turns up in kitchen drawers today, long after anyone remembers why it is shaped that way. It is worth saying plainly that the grapefruit diet itself was a fad, not a proven method, and the nutrition science behind it was thin even by the standards of its own decade. What survived was not the diet. It was the ritual, the halved fruit, the little spoon, the sugar bowl passed across the table. Families kept doing it long after anyone remembered it started as a weight loss trend rather than just a nice way to start a Sunday. Buttermilk pancakes made from real soured milk, not the boxed mix, had a tang and a lightness that modern pancakes rarely have. Farm households often had buttermilk left over from churning their own butter, so the pancakes were a way to use it before it spoiled. The batter needed no written measurements, just a feel for how thick it should pour off the spoon, and that feel is exactly the kind of knowledge that never made it into a cookbook. Johnnycakes, thin cornmeal griddle cakes with almost no flour at all, go back to colonial New England and were still a common breakfast in parts of Rhode Island and the rural Northeast through the 1950s. They cooked fast on a hot griddle, crisped at the edges, and were often eaten plain or with a little butter rather than syrup. The dish carried a name nobody could fully explain even then. Some said it was a corruption of journey cake, made for travelers who needed something that kept well. Sour cream coffee cake was Sunday morning fare, baked in a cast-iron skillet rather than a modern bakery pan, dense and rich with a cinnamon streusel pressed into the top. It was called coffee cake because it was meant to be eaten alongside a cup of coffee, not because it contained any. The sour cream kept it moist for days, and a slice sitting under a glass dome was a common sight on a 1950s kitchen counter. Codfish cakes were a New England breakfast that most of the country has completely forgotten, built from salt cod that had been soaked overnight to pull the salt back out, mixed with mashed potato, and fried into small, crisp patties. Coastal families ate them because salt cod kept for months without refrigeration. a holdover from a time before reliable cold storage, and by the 1950s, it was still common in fishing towns, even though most American kitchens had a working icebox by then. Livermush is still sold in parts of North and South Carolina, but almost nowhere else, and most Americans have never heard the name. It is a loaf of pork liver, head meat, and cornmeal, sliced and fried crisp like Scrapple, and it carries the same frugal logic, using the whole animal instead of throwing anything away. Local grocery stores in the Carolina foothills still stock it today, one of the few dishes on this list that never fully vanished, just narrowed down to a small home region. Around Cincinnati and the Ohio River Valley, German immigrant families made a similar dish called Goetta, pork and beef, combined with steel-cut oats instead of cornmeal, seasoned with onion and a little clove, then sliced and fried. It became so specific to that one region that most people, even a few states away, have never tasted it, but around Cincinnati, it never left. Local butchers there still make it fresh today, a direct line back to 1950s German-American kitchens. Souse, sometimes called head cheese, was served cold at breakfast in rural households across the South and Midwest, a jellied loaf made from pork trimmings set in their own broth. It sounds unusual today, almost unthinkable to some, but it was simply what a family did with the parts of the hog that would otherwise go to waste after a fall butchering. Sliced thin and eaten cold with a little vinegar, it was ordinary Tuesday fare on a farm that raised its own pigs. Brains and eggs was a real breakfast dish in many 1950s households, most often calf brains scrambled together with eggs, and it belonged to the same nothing-wasted tradition as Scrapple and Livermush. It has essentially disappeared today, partly because of cost and availability, and partly because tastes and food safety understanding around organ meats shifted in the decades after. We mention it here only as documentary history, a window into how differently that generation thought about a whole animal, not as something to recreate. Creamed eggs on toast took the same white sauce technique as creamed chipped beef and used hard-boiled eggs instead of dried beef, sliced and folded into a peppery cream sauce, spooned over toast points. It was a Lenten Friday standby in many Catholic households, when meat was off the table but eggs were not, and it stretched a half-dozen eggs into a filling breakfast for a family of 5 or 6 without anyone leaving the table hungry. Toast with bacon drippings and cane syrup was about as plain a breakfast as a 1950s kitchen produced, and some families called it exactly what it was, a poor man's breakfast. Bread toasted, spread with warm bacon fat instead of butter, drizzled with cane syrup. It cost almost nothing, and it used the dripping sitting in the skillet every single morning anyway. Nobody was embarrassed to serve it. It was simply what Tuesday looked like in a lot of houses. Your grandmother knew something they stopped teaching, and the margarine ritual is one of the strangest examples. In many states, colored margarine was restricted or taxed for years because of dairy industry pressure, so margarine came sold white, with a small dye pellet packed inside the bag. A child at the breakfast table might watch a parent knead that dye through the margarine by hand until it turned yellow enough to pass for butter, a small daily performance almost nobody remembers today. Instant cream of wheat with canned evaporated milk was one of the most common bowls on a 1950s breakfast table, a smooth, hot cereal stirred with a splash of thick canned milk instead of fresh, because evaporated milk kept in the pantry without refrigeration and cost less than fresh milk in many towns. It was quick, it was filling, and it needed no eggs, no meat, and almost no cleanup, which mattered enormously on a school morning with 3 or 4 children to get out the door. Percolator coffee with chicory was a southern habit that stretched a smaller amount of coffee further. Roasted chicory root ground in with the beans to add body and a slightly bitter, almost chocolate note. It came originally from wartime coffee shortages, when chicory stretched what little coffee could be found, and by the 1950s, many Southern households simply preferred the taste and kept making it that way long after coffee itself was easy to buy again. Deviled ham on toast came straight from a small tin, minced ham blended with mustard and a little vinegar into a spreadable paste, sold by Underwood since the 1860s and still a common pantry item in the 1950s. Spread cold on toast, it needed no cooking at all, which made it the fastest breakfast on this entire list, the kind of thing a working father grabbed on his way out the door to catch an early shift. Fried apples and bacon-paired sliced apples cooked down soft in bacon drippings with a little sugar and cinnamon, served alongside or even on top of crisp bacon strips. It was an autumn and winter dish especially, when a family's own stored apples were plentiful and needed using before they went soft in the cellar. The sweetness of the apples against the salt of the bacon fat gave the dish a balance that modern breakfast rarely bothers to recreate. Cottage cheese with stewed fruit was another one of the era's reducing breakfasts, marketed as the light choice for women watching their weight, much like the grapefruit half. A scoop of cottage cheese beside canned or home-stewed peaches or pears, sometimes with a sprinkle of cinnamon. It is worth naming plainly that this was diet fad marketing of its time, not a proven method, the same way today's trends come and go, just dressed in 1950s language instead of ours. Soda crackers crumbled into warm milk was a habit that mostly belonged to older cooks in the 1950s, women who had come up during the Depression and never quite let go of it, even once times were better. It cost almost nothing. It settled an upset stomach, and it was often what an elderly relative living with the family ate quietly while the rest of the table had eggs and toast, a small daily reminder of leaner years that never fully left the house. Canned tomato gravy over biscuits was a Southern breakfast built almost entirely from the pantry shelf. Canned tomatoes simmered down with a little flour and bacon drippings into a thick, tangy gravy, poured over split biscuits. It gave a family a hot vegetable at breakfast in the dead of winter, months after the garden tomatoes were gone, using only what had been put up in mason jars back in August. Hominy fried in bacon fat was corn that had been treated with lye or lime to soften the hull, a process called nixtamalization that had been used in the Americas for thousands of years before it ever reached a 1950s cast iron skillet. Drained from the can or made fresh, then fried until the edges browned and crisped, it gave a starchy, slightly chewy side dish that filled out a breakfast plate without costing much of anything at all. Refrigeration is really the hinge this whole story turns on. In 1940, fewer than half of American homes owned a mechanical refrigerator. By 1950, that number had climbed dramatically, and it changed which breakfasts were even possible. Milk toast, junket, cream dishes, all of them depended on fresh milk being reliably on hand rather than delivered daily in small amounts or kept in an icebox that needed a fresh block of ice every few days. Egg consumption in America peaked right around this same post-war window, families eating far more eggs per year on average than we do today. Eggs were cheap, they were local. Many families kept their own hens even in small towns, and no one had yet been told to worry about cholesterol. That warning was still more than a decade away. For now, eggs sat at the center of the American breakfast table without a single asterisk attached to them. It matters to say clearly that the health guidance around eggs and cholesterol shifted more than once over the following decades. Warnings that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s pushed many of these egg-heavy breakfasts out of favor, and later nutritional research softened that same warning considerably. We are not here to tell you what to eat. We are here to tell you what changed and why a plate that once seemed completely ordinary came to feel almost suspicious for a generation. Lard was still the standard fat in most American kitchens through this decade, used for frying, for biscuit making, for the pie crusts that sometimes even showed up at breakfast in farm households. Crisco had been on shelves since 1911, but lard remained cheaper and more available in rural kitchens especially, rendered right at home after a hog was butchered in the fall and stored in tins that lasted the family most of the winter. The percolator was the sound of a 1950s morning, before anyone said a single word. The gurgle, The smell filling the kitchen before the coffee ever touched a cup, that ritual sat underneath nearly every dish on this list. Instant coffee had grown popular after the war, when the military drove huge demand for it overseas. But in most homes, the percolator stayed on the stove because instant simply never smelled the same walking into the kitchen. The kitchen remembers, even when we forget, and nowhere is that clearer than in how these dishes actually died out. It was not that people stopped liking them. Working schedules changed as more women took paying jobs outside the home through the 1960s and 1970s, and a 15-minute stovetop breakfast simply stopped fitting the morning. The dishes did not fail. The mornings around them changed shape entirely. Cold cereal was already on shelves in the 1950s, but it had not yet won. Hot, cooked breakfast remained the daily norm in most households through the decade, and cereal's total takeover of the American morning was still a decade or two away. What tipped the scale was not the cereal itself, but the marketing built around it. Saturday morning cartoons paired with sugar-coated boxes aimed directly at children rather than their mothers. There is a common myth that the frozen TV dinner covered breakfast back then too, but Swanson's original frozen tray, launched in the early 1950s, was built for dinner and dinner only. Frozen breakfast food, the waffles, the sandwiches, the whole category we take for granted at the grocery store today, mostly did not exist yet. Whatever landed on a 1950s breakfast table almost always came from a stovetop, not a freezer. Picture the actual rhythm of a weekday morning in a house like this. Someone up before dawn to start the stove, biscuits in the oven, gravy in the skillet, coffee perking on the back burner, and everyone gathering at a table set the night before. It was not fast. It was not simple. It took real time and real attention, and that is exactly why so much of it quietly disappeared once time became the one thing nobody had enough of. Consider how many of these 25 dishes share the exact same instinct underneath them. Nothing wasted. Stale bread became milk toast, leftover cornmeal became fried mush, hog scraps became scrapple, livermush, souse. Salt cod kept for months became codfish cakes. This was not a cuisine built around indulgence. It was a cuisine built around care, the quiet daily discipline of a homemaker, making sure nothing in that kitchen ever went to waste. It is worth pausing here to say this plainly because it matters. None of these dishes were medicine. None of them cured anything or treated anything, whatever a grandmother might have believed about milquetoast settling a stomach or Postum being gentler than coffee. They were comfort, habit, and thrift, not treatment. We tell their story because it is honest history, not because any of it should guide what you eat or drink today. Think about the sheer variety hiding inside a single decade of American breakfast. New England salt cod cakes, Pennsylvania Dutch scrapple, Carolina livermush, Cincinnati Goetta, Southern grits and red-eye gravy, Midwestern fried mush. Every region had built its own answer to the same basic problem. How do you feed a family a hot, filling breakfast on very little money using whatever your own local land and local butcher provided? A few of these dishes never actually left. They just shrank down to a single region. Scrapple is still sold in Pennsylvania and the Mid-Atlantic. Livermush is still in Carolina grocery stores. Goetta is still made fresh by butchers around Cincinnati. Grits and red-eye gravy still show up on diner menus across the South. These are not resurrected dishes. They are survivors, dishes that simply never got the memo that the rest of the country moved on. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and that is really the heart of why these 25 breakfasts matter. Nobody in 1953 thought they were documenting history. They were just making breakfast. But every one of these dishes is a small, precise record of what a family could afford, what the land nearby provided, and what a mother had learned from her own mother without a single word written down. Picture the grocery list for a week of these breakfasts, and it looks almost nothing like a modern list. Cornmeal, salt pork, a sack of flour, a jug of sorghum, a dozen eggs from your own hens, a tin of evaporated milk for the pantry shelf. Almost everything shelf-stable or produced within a few miles of the house. A modern breakfast, by contrast, might travel further to reach your table than an entire 1950s family traveled in a year. Even the tools these women worked with are mostly gone from modern kitchens. The grapefruit spoon, the percolator basket that needed cleaning every single morning, the dye pellet tucked inside a bag of white margarine, small specific objects that tell you exactly what a kitchen expected of a woman on an average Tuesday, none of it labor-saving in the way we think of convenience today, all of it simply part of the job. By the early 1960s, the cracks were already showing. Sugar cereal boxes with cartoon mascots sat next to the same cornmeal and lard that had fed the previous decade, and children were beginning to ask for the cereal instead. It was a slow shift, not a sudden one. More households cooking hot breakfast on weekends only, cereal filling in the gaps on busy weekday mornings, until eventually the weekday habit became the only habit left. It is easy from a distance to romanticize all of this, and Clara would rather be honest with you than sentimental. These breakfasts were often made out of necessity, not leisure. A woman standing over a hot stove at 5 in the morning frying mush or stirring gravy was not living some peaceful golden age. She was working, often exhausted, often with very little help, and the dish on the table was proof of that labor as much as it was comfort. And yet there was real intention in it too, a kind of care that gets lost when a breakfast comes out of a box in 90 seconds. Choosing sorghum over sugar because it was what the family could afford and trade for locally. Timing the mush to set overnight so it sliced clean in the morning, knowing exactly how long milk needed to warm before it scalded. That is not nostalgia talking. That is genuine skill, earned the hard way, one ordinary Tuesday at a time. Some of these dishes did carry real risk by modern standards, and it is worth naming that honestly, rather than glossing over it. Organ meats like brains, prepared without the food safety understanding we have today, or salt-cured meats eaten regularly, are the kind of thing later decades approached with far more caution. That caution was not wrong. It is simply part of why some of these dishes faded, alongside the changes in daily schedules and grocery habits. Compare that to today's guidance, which has actually loosened around some of what once seemed alarming. Dietary cholesterol from eggs no longer carries the same strict daily cap that public health messaging pushed for decades. That does not mean go recreate a 1950s breakfast exactly as written. It means the story of these dishes is more complicated than simply healthy versus unhealthy, and Nancy, more than anyone, deserves that nuance instead of a flattened verdict. Think about how differently a modern grocery store shelf reads compared to a 1950s pantry. A can of evaporated milk that once sat beside the flour and cornmeal now sits in a small forgotten aisle most shoppers walk past entirely. Junket mix, if a store carries it at all, sits gathering dust next to gelatin. These are not ingredients that vanished from the earth. They are ingredients that vanished from habit, still sitting quietly on a shelf somewhere waiting. There is something worth noticing in how many of these dishes involved the whole family at the table at the same time, every morning, not just on holidays. No phones to check, no separate schedules pulling everyone in different directions before 8 in the morning. Whatever else was true about the labor and the limits of that decade, the table itself gathered people in a way that has become genuinely rare in modern households. If you go looking today, a handful of these dishes are having a small, quiet revival, mostly among home cooks curious about where their own family recipes came from. Scrapple and Livermush still sell in their home regions. Fried cornmeal mush occasionally turns up on a farm-to-table breakfast menu, dressed up with a fancier name. It is not a trend exactly, more a slow rediscovery by people who wanted to taste what their grandmother actually ate. It disappeared from store shelves, but it still works, in the sense that the habits underneath these dishes, thrift, patience, using what you have before it spoils, never actually stopped being useful. The specific recipes may be gone from most kitchens. The instinct behind them, the refusal to waste a single scrap of food, is exactly the kind of thing worth remembering, even if you never fry a single slice of cornmeal mush yourself. Some families kept a version of these breakfasts going far longer than the rest of the country, particularly in rural areas where the working rhythm of the day had not changed the way it had in the cities. A farmer heading out at dawn to milk cows and feed livestock needed a heavier, slower breakfast than an office worker catching a bus, and that basic difference in daily labor is part of why these dishes lasted longest, exactly where the old rhythms lasted longest too. It is worth remembering, too, that not every household had the same version of this story. Families with less money leaned harder on the cheapest dishes on this list: milk toast, fried mush, salt pork gravy, week after week without much variation. Families with a bit more room in the budget could afford codfish cakes or a real ham for the red-eye gravy more often. The 25 dishes on this list were not evenly distributed. They followed the money, the same as everything else. Consider, too, how much of this knowledge lived only in the body and never made it to paper. A recipe card might say a pinch of this or enough milk to cover, because the actual knowledge was in the hands, in years of watching and doing. When that generation of women stopped cooking these dishes daily, an enormous amount of practical, hard-won knowledge simply stopped being passed down, not because anyone chose to forget it, but because nobody wrote it down in time. This is really why a channel like this one exists at all, to go looking for what was never written down properly and put it back into words before it disappears from memory completely. Every dish on this list survived somewhere, in a church cookbook typed on a mimeograph machine, in an oral history recording, in a grandmother's memory that a granddaughter finally thought to ask about before it was too late. That effort is worth something. Think about the 25 dishes together for a moment, not as separate recipes, but as a single portrait of a decade. Frugal, regional, built around eggs and cornmeal and whatever fat was in the pan already, shaped by a war that had just ended and a health warning that had not yet arrived. That is the actual texture of the 1950s breakfast table, richer and stranger and more resourceful than the simple bacon and eggs postcard image most people carry around in their heads. If your own family had a version of one of these dishes, the odds are decent it looked a little different from how we described it here. A little more sugar in one house, a little less salt pork in another. That is exactly how this kind of food history works. It was never standardized, never printed the same way twice, and that variation from kitchen to kitchen is part of what made it feel like it belonged to your family specifically, rather than to a cookbook everyone owned. Somewhere out there right now, an elderly relative still remembers the exact texture of fried mush the way their mother made it, the exact ratio of sugar in the milk toast, the exact color margarine needed to turn before it looked right. That knowledge is still recoverable, but only for a little while longer. And that is really the quiet urgency underneath a video like this one, not nostalgia for its own sake, but a closing window. Your grandmother knew something they stopped teaching, and it was not really about the recipes themselves. It was about paying close attention to very little, stretching what you had without complaint, and treating an ordinary Tuesday breakfast as worth doing properly, even when nobody outside the family would ever see it or know the difference. That habit of attention is the actual inheritance here, more than any single dish on this list. 25 dishes, 1 decade, and a single thread running underneath all of it. Nothing wasted, everyone fed, very little written down. From milk toast to livermush to a bag of margarine kneaded yellow by hand, each one is a small, honest record of a kitchen doing more with less. Most of them are gone from daily life now, but none of them are truly lost. Not as long as someone keeps telling the story properly. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and that is as true of your own family's kitchen as it is of any dish on this list. Somewhere in a relative's memory or a stained recipe card in a drawer, there is probably a breakfast just like these waiting for someone to ask about it before it disappears completely. That is worth doing, and it is worth doing soon. The kitchen remembers, even when we forget, and that is why this channel keeps going back to find these dishes before they slip away for good. If one of these 25 breakfasts brought back a memory of your own mother or grandmother standing at that same stove, tell me about it in the comments. I read everyone. Subscribe if you want more of the Forgotten Kitchen, and I will see you in the next one.